Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. My guest today is Prem Kumar. He was a senior director for Middle East and North Africa under the Obama administration in the National Security Council between 2013 and 2015. He is now a principal with the Albright Stonebridge Consulting Group in Washington, D.C., where he joins us from. Thank you very much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to begin with the crisis in the Gulf, pitting Qatar against a number of countries, starting with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. It's been ongoing for several weeks now. People thought it wouldn't end up quickly. There was a similar crisis a few years ago when you were in the Obama administration. Why is it different this time around?
Well, Mark, I think the main difference, frankly, is the Trump administration. When President Trump visited Riyadh just a couple months ago, he made clear to the leaders there, in particular the Saudi king and the leadership of the UAE, that he supported them almost 100%, and that they needed to work together to confront terrorism, sources of financing for terrorism, etc. And I think that the Saudis and Emiratis took from that basically a blank check to confront old adversaries, and Qatar has been an adversary of sorts for many years, with what they expected to be the full backing of the United States.
But during the previous crisis a couple of years ago, when you were in power, there was this crisis. Was there already the same problem between those countries, essentially accusing Qatar of financing terrorism? And I mean, did you see any evidence of that? Or do you think this is essentially made up because they want to settle scores with Qatar?
No, I think it's not made up. I think that there have been real concerns about Qatar's support for certain extremist groups, the ease with which some Qatari private individuals have been able to support extremist groups, and also, frankly, with official Qatari policy in places like Syria in particular, but also vis-a-vis Al Jazeera and what it has broadcast around the Arab world. So I think there have been legitimate grievances. Now, Qatar is not the only case where there has been a problem in terms of support for extremist groups and terrorist finance.
Saudi Arabia might be
one. In many
one.
Cases. Right, yes. No, I think that's been a problem across the Gulf, frankly. Qatar stands out because the other Gulf countries, the UAE and Saudi, have long been on the other side of the argument with regard particularly to Iran, to Hezbollah, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's why this crisis now has become so much more acute, that they have long wanted to resolve this issue with Qatar, and they saw an opening to do so in the past couple months.
Right. Are they also maybe seeing some comfort in the mixed messages they're getting from Washington? Essentially, as you described early on, a president clearly tilting in favor of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain, and State Department. We saw Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, going to the region, asking them to stop, essentially, bullying Qatar. And so, obviously, the mixed messages are probably not helping solving this crisis.
No, I don't think they are. And frankly, I don't think that the Saudis or Emiratis thought that they would get these kinds of mixed messages from the U.S. administration, because President Trump assured them in Riyadh that they would have his full support. And I think they also probably discussed the Qatar issue specifically. So after they announced this basically embargo against Qatar and cut off, the border crossings, they were very gratified to see that President Trump supported them strongly, but then somewhat mystified over the next couple of days to see that the State Department was saying something very different, that Secretary Tillerson was clearly trying to mediate, and that, I think, has contributed to more pressure on the Saudis and Emiratis than they probably expected at the beginning of this crisis.
I want to shift to another crisis, Israel-Palestine. Obviously, we're seeing tensions in Jerusalem, tensions between Israel and Jordan, but maybe to try to see it from a broader angle, Donald Trump has said he wants to cut a deal. We know this has been a major failure of the Clinton, the Bush, the Obama administration. You were involved in those efforts. Why would Donald Trump achieve what you all have failed to achieve?
Well, I know that President Trump likes to think of himself as the ultimate deal maker. In this case, I think there is no deal to be made. And so I think the short answer to your question is that he will not succeed where others have failed, because frankly, there isn't a zone of overlap between the Israeli and Palestinian leadership right now.
So the peace process is dead? Is this what you're saying?
The peace process has been dead, frankly, for several years. Just a question of how much the international community has tried to resuscitate it, even if the parties themselves are not really prepared to move forward.
Right. Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously, he has had a frosty relationship, let's put it this way, with President Obama. You've had to deal with him. Is he part of the problem because he generally doesn't really want a Palestinian state, from your interactions with him and his entourage?
Well, I think what he would say, and I've had many dealings with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
I'm interested in what you're saying, not in what he would say.
Yes. Well, I think that he is ready to accept a Palestinian state on his terms. But that's very important. What he means by that is a completely demilitarized Palestinian state with an Israeli security presence inside, where Israel gets to redeploy whenever it wants, where Jerusalem is still Israel's capital and the Palestinians have only a token presence on the outskirts. That's what he envisions, and where no Palestinian refugees return to Israel, and even Israel gets to control the Palestinian refugees who return to the Palestinian state. That's the kind of quote-unquote state that he envisions. I think the problem is that neither the Palestinians nor the rest of the international community would ever accept that.
Right. I want to turn lastly to Syria. This has probably been the biggest failure of the Obama administration. I know some members of the administration have expressed regret. We're now learning that the U.S. will stop supporting the Syrian rebels. This is probably the death knell of a failed U.S. policy. Would you agree with that?
I don't think it's any secret that Syria has been a huge issue for the U.S. for the past several years, for the Obama administration, that it was a failure in many respects. The question, though, is whether...
Was it a failure of vision or what? What was it a failure of exactly?
Well, I think any time that close to 300,000 people die in a conflict, it is a moral failure and a really significant one. This is one that we will live with for years, if not generations. And so we should be able to respond to these kinds of conflicts better. Now, the challenge over the past 9 years or so has been that there haven't been very many good answers, and I'm personally not sure that if the United States had intervened that we would have produced a very different outcome. It's a failure because we couldn't come up with a better response, but unfortunately it's still not clear what that response should have been.
Right. I mean, for you, what's the biggest regret? We know, for example, Secretary of State John Kerry had pushed for a more robust presence, military presence on the ground here in France and in other places. The now infamous red line over the use of chemical weapons in the summer of 2003 was the decisive moment when the West failed. For you, what was the key moment where you think this might have changed the situation, with no guarantee, obviously?
Right. Well, I think that red line saga in the summer of 2013 was the pivotal moment for U.S. policy towards Syria and probably Western policy as well. I was with Secretary Kerry in Paris and London on that trip, and I think that if we had followed through on those strikes, then at least we would have had the credibility to do more in that conflict if we thought it made sense. Now, that's not to say that it necessarily would have, but the fact that we didn't follow through on that red line meant that we lost that credibility at a pretty early point.
Why do you think President Obama stepped back? Yes, we know the British Parliament decision and so on, but nevertheless, why do you think he did not pull the trigger in the end?
I think that he genuinely wanted Congress to support him in that decision, because he knew that if we did take military action in response to the use of chemical weapons, that it probably wasn't going to be the last time that the U.S. would have to intervene militarily in Syria. And he wanted that policy to be sustainable because, as we saw during the Iraq War, even if a president decides to use force at the beginning with popular support, often that kind of campaign will last for many years. And if you don't have the support of the American people, or in the case of the French decision, the French people, or the British public, then it's going to be very hard to prosecute that war to victory.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Prem Kumar, for sharing your views on the volatile situation in the Gulf and in the Middle East. Thank you very much for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.